La Cristiada, the Cristero War, was a religious conflict in Mexico. It tore families apart and killed thousands from 1926 to 1929, and all this after more than a decade of violence unleashed by the Mexican Revolution. The revolutionary constitution of 1917 claimed to limit the power of the Catholic Church. But this was not attempted in earnest until Plutarco Elias Calles became president of Mexico in 1924. Mexican Catholics rallied against Calles' anti-clericalism, and in July 1926 the church went on strike, suspending religious services and sacraments. This led to a spontaneous uprising in many parts of the country. Although the war ended in 1929 with a federal government victory, the aftershocks of this violence plagued Mexico until as late as the 1940s in some places. I've been researching this for 4 years with the University of Kent, and what I want to do is to show that this did not just pit the church against the state, but also town against country, village against village, and family against family. Zacatecas, like the rest of western Mexico, was deeply affected by the Cristero War. To this day, the war continues to affect the lives of ordinary people and even their relations with church and state. Many people see this as a religious war, and indeed it was a religious war, but it was much more than that. It was a civil war, a bloody, complicated and violent affair that continues to affect the lives of people of this state and the region beyond. My research focuses on the people caught up in this war and who had to pick sides. Women, indigenous people and ordinary civilians, and how they survived. I travelled to Mexico City to meet Jean Mayer, a pioneering historian who began working on the Cristero War over 50 years ago, at a time when memories were still raw and neither church nor state welcomed research into this tragic episode in Mexican history.
The Cristiada was a civil war, and it's the same story as in every civil war. People have a lot of different motivations, and I'm discovering some fantastic things that I ignored completely. And for instance, that really the great majority of the Mexican bishops was not in favor of the war, was not even in favor of the suspension of the cult. It was a kind of imposition, a small radical group, the brothers of the radical anti-clerical.
These aspects are what I wanted to delve into. It led me to try to find someone who could tell their story to me and be an example of the pain caused and still felt a century on.
Muchísimas gracias. Sí, aquí estoy otra vez, esta vez con el equipo de hecho de Kent TV, es un canal regional de radio.
This is a local radio station in Fresnillo in Mexico, where I came to talk about connecting my research to the local community. And one of the stories that arose from that was the story of Aurora, a very old lady whose father was killed in the Cristero War. Her family was exactly what I wanted to find, so that we could see the real impact on families who were caught up in the danger and chaos of the war. To this day, it's still hard for the family of Toribio to speak about when he died. But 103-year-old Aurora and her son Raúl spoke of their family's experience of the Cristero War.
Mi madre acostumbró relatarnos la historia del abuelo y de la guerra entre cristeros y federales desde muy temprana edad. Y para ella fue sumamente dolorosa porque vio cómo mataban a mi abuelo en su casa, vio cómo caía al suelo e incluso una tía de ella, Juanita, le quitó el gabán al abuelo e hizo que mi madre lo lavara en el río, donde ella normalmente nadaba. Para nosotros como mexicanos fue una de las guerras más cruentas y más sanguinarias que ha sufrido México. El padre de mi madre el abuelo Toribio Cepeda, que nosotros lo consideramos un mártir de esa revolución.
Records tend to be biased towards the church or the state, but part of this hope for a better understanding is opening a museum in Guadalupe, Zacatecas. My research, along with the help of local people, will spread understanding to a town that was central in the conflict. We got special access to a rare archive which will help us expand our knowledge and inform people here of what their ancestors went through.
Sigue siendo muy complicado hablar del conflicto religioso en Zacatecas, tanto por el Estado como por la Iglesia. Creo que a casi 100 años del inicio podemos estar en condiciones de entablar nuevas perspectivas que hablen de los dos lados y compaginarlas en un solo proyecto. Y sobre todo que tiene un beneficio a la población para entender de mejor manera cómo fue el conflicto, que nos permite entender que ni el Estado actuó de una manera de solamente ir hacia los católicos, como que la Iglesia tampoco se sublevó por nada. Entonces creo que la apertura de archivos a finales del siglo XX, los archivos judiciales, nos va a permitir tener una mejor visión de la situación, sobre todo porque los archivos del gobierno del Estado sufrieron una inundación o algunos fueron quemados, también algunos municipales.
Behind me on this hill you can see the letters Viva Cristo Rey, long live Christ the King. You can only find letters like this in the western parts of Mexico where the Cristero War was fought. It gives us an idea about how people in this area remember the conflict as fundamentally a religious crusade. This museum is a vital bit of history, and one that the residents of San Julián felt passionate enough to fund with a public subscription. The artefacts within were donated from people in the town, which shows how crucial it is to these rural areas to celebrate their martyred ancestors.
Este museo está hecho por los sanjulianenses para los sanjulianenses. Entonces el objetivo es que este lugar sea una casa de resguardo de la memoria histórica, mostrar esta parte de la historia que mucho tiempo fue olvidada y que fue negada por los libros de historia de México. Y el objetivo es que no se pierda esa historia, por lo tanto el museo tiene como objetivo mostrar desde los antecedentes a nivel nacional, estatal, regional y local.
The need to relay a clear and objective vision of the war led me to what is a fascinating way of telling its story. Ballads and songs were passed down through generations. They serve as a place to store and discover history, and a crucial addition to my research.
El corrido no es general en toda la República Mexicana, sino de una parte de la República, ¿no? Y está muy ligado pues a las sociedades más de rancho, ¿no? El corrido jugó un papel fundamental para narrar los hechos que estaban produciéndose en ese momento, ¿no? Pues se siguen interpretando y se siguen recordando, porque es algo popular, ¿no? Se escribe y se canta para la gente, para narrarle los hechos que se están produciendo y que merecen la pena recordarse, ¿no?
My research evolves our understanding of a time in Mexico that is vitally important to remember. Innocent lives in turmoil, stuck between two of the most influential powers at the time. Indigenous regions in the center-west, especially the Tepehuano of Durango, joined the Cristero revolt to ward off the encroachment of the Mexican state onto their ancestral lands and their everyday traditions. Here the suffering of the Civil War did not really end until the 1940s. Like all civil wars, civilians were the main victims. Women played a key role as well, acting as couriers, spies, smugglers, and in traditional roles such as cooks, cleaners, and nurses for Cristero troops. Rural civilians were reconcentrated or driven off their estates, villages and ranches in order to create free fire zones for the federal army. Conditions facing refugees in overcrowded towns were appalling, but civilians who defied the government to return home faced reprisals from either the federal army or from the Cristeros. Rural landowners were afraid of the Mexican Revolution's plans to break up the larger states and replace them with communal land holdings. But their fear led many of them to support the Cristero rebels.
The great agrarian reform in Mexico happened during the following years, in the 30s, maybe as a consequence of the Cristiada. Maybe the government thought, if we want to control or to get the sympathy of the Mexican people, we have to give the land. And some peasants received the land, but with a condition. You have to defend the government. Take the gun and be our counter-guerrilla against the Cristero. So the land question was a factor in the civil war, in that dimension of civil war that was part of the tragedy.